Well, for me, an information landscape is a complex of people and players and venues and formats uh, and hierarchies, both within a discipline and more broadly where that discipline intersects, brushes up, overlaps other disciplines. And so the landscape is kind of an interesting word because you can think about what grows, what spreads, what's a weed, and what changes. And I like the term landscape because that admits of change. And certainly the landscape of SoTL publishing has been quite dynamic, and it's really interesting to think about in terms of variety of formats and that changing over time, variety of venues and that changing over time, and more imports from other disciplines and both exports to other disciplines. So the garden, the landscape spreading into other landscapes. The information landscape is both the documents and the text that people have spoken, the touch points. So if you think about, again, a landscape, what's solid in a landscape, the bedrock forms, right? So I would say in SoTL, something like Pat Hutchings' questions are a big bedrock around which a lot of the SoTL landscape forms. It's dynamic. It informs bits of information inform each other. They don't necessarily exist in isolation. So this large structural boulder of Pat's questions have a lot of other SoTL information hanging off of it and a lot of other things flowing from it, and it directs water/attention and resources to other kinds of information that flourish or don't, perhaps. I've been following SoTL for quite some time. I had to look back on my records, and 2008 was sort of when I started following it more intently. And there were a couple of early journals, but most of the information flow happened at conferences between people practicing SoTL. Most of the information flow happened at conferences and at workshops like the Castle Crowd workshop, and it happened among a relatively small group of core people, and then happened in discipline-specific journals from people reaching out for that, because there were a very limited venue for traditional academic discourse in SoTL. In SoTL-specific journals, there were a couple. Most of the idea exchange, the information exchange, from what I could see, was happening at the conferences, which were rich but not well captured. So those early conferences, if you're lucky, you can find a book of abstracts, but that's it. And so a lot of the early SoTL work is kind of ephemeral. Some of it got published in disciplinary journals, a very small percent got published in SoTL journals, and some of the early books, touchstone books, but a lot of it was sort of floating in the air and got hived off into discipline-specific journals. It was an interesting nascent phenomenon. And then TLI, Teaching and Learning Inquiry, came along and had as its mandate to become a solid journal to collect and disseminate material in SoTL, and I think did so very effectively. And because the people involved in that were also the people involved in the major international conference, there was quite a lot of synergy, which there might not have been with the 2 or 3 other journals that had been around in SoTL a bit longer. It's broadened, it's deepened, it's gotten in many ways more like traditional academic publishing, in that there's more and more venues for scholarship. There's actually more and more venues that capture academic papers, like the Mount Royal Institute's publishing of papers from their SoTL symposium in Banff. It has in some ways kind of solidified in form. And so some of the early days of SoTL, a lot of the publishing was perhaps more experimental. There were more blog posts, there were more poems in some of the SoTL literature. And I think as it's grown up, it's become more formalized and perhaps more traditionally structured. It is slowly becoming more diverse in terms of international writers and international venues for SoTL discourse. It's a bit like the information literacy discourse, if you follow the same path, right? It was deciding who and what it was as a discipline and what the boundaries were, and then deciding who got to play in the discipline. And I think because there's still a lot of publishing that happens in discipline-specific journals as well as in SoTL, it has to some extent escaped the phenomenon of speaking only to the choir, which I think is a danger of SoTL, is that it becomes too closed a group, speaking only to people who already care about SoTL. But I think a real strength is the publishing out in disciplinary teaching journals, disciplinary research journals, because I think that keeps that nutrient cycle, for want of a better term, flowing, and it keeps those membranes permeable, which is a concern that I would have if that wasn't happening, but it's still happening a lot. Not all SoTL publishing has coalesced into SoTL venues. A couple of things. I find what I just said, that permeability, that it happens both in SoTL journals where I think people talk about SoTL first and discipline second, and then the discipline specific journals where maybe then that's a way of SoTL permeating more disciplines and more disciplinary conversations. I think the open access aspect of SoTL, I think the fact that so many of the journals are open access, I think is really key to its spread. I think it's going to be key to its internationalization as it's happening. I think it's key to increasing the diversity of viewpoints. I think it's been interesting to see that from the beginning, the professional development folks have had a really strong current, if you will, in the flow of information. So there's a lot of SoTL work on how to support SoTL workers, not just what SoTL work is like in the classroom. I think one of the more fascinating threads, and it's relatively recent, is the involvement of students. So the students as partners and other ways of involving students, not just as participants in research or subjects of research, but as participants in and driving not just how we do it, but what questions we ask. And I think that's a really interesting and positive development of SoTL that I'm not seeing as much in other academic discourses. It's varied. On a very basic note is who needs to hear what you're writing about. So when you're thinking about where you're going to disseminate SoTL literature and where you're going to publish it, is this something that is about and for the SoTL community, or is this something you want to direct at your discipline community or at higher education teaching more broadly than SoTL? And you need to think about that at the beginning, because it does, to a certain extent, determine what you spend time describing in detail and what you don't. And it determines what level of which jargon you use. So I think that would be something to think about, who you're writing for, who needs to hear what you have to say. There's a hard truth in that when you're thinking about where you're going to disseminate your information as a scholar, what's going to count for your institution. That's a hard truth, and you need to think about that. But the best advice I can give to people who want to know is read widely, read things you don't think you'll be interested in. Look at both the SoTL specific publications and track down through broad searches what journals in your discipline are publishing SoTL, and read what gets published there. Start looking for models both of what you want to do and what you want to avoid. I just think it's a really exciting time for the information landscape of SoTL, both for the increasing internationalization, for the increasing involvement of students as partners, for the increasingly deep questions that I'm seeing in SoTL that certainly weren't part of a lot of the published discourse early on, and that's looking at critical pedagogy, looking at critical theory as applied to SoTL, and having some really deep conversations about who gets to play in this particular playground, and who isn't feeling as invited, as welcome as, or feeling that they belong as much in this, and why is that, and what questions get asked. Having a good hard think about, and it's at a time in its lifespan as a discipline that it can take these questions and some serious hard looks about where we are, where we're going, where we want to go as a discipline.